What's going on, Security Ninjas? Samuel here, and I like to hack things. Today, I have an amazing video lined up for you. It's titled, What is Threat Hunting? An interview with Ashley and Josh. So we're going to find out what threat hunting is and how you can get into it, and what skills are necessary for that type of role. You've probably heard threat hunting tossed around, or maybe you've always been interested in it. So this interview with these two amazing threat hunters will get you started on that path. All right, let's get into the interview. All right, so welcome to the interview. What is threat hunting? I'm here with Ashley and Josh, some of the most talented threat hunters that I know. They're going to share their experiences and what they think threat hunting is, and possibly on how you can get into threat hunting. So let's go ahead and kick it off with Ashley. Why don't you go ahead and tell everyone about yourself and how you got into tech or security?
Hey everyone, I'm Ashley. I actually started off as a system admin. I spent 4 years doing kind of a little bit of everything, as I'm sure most people who have spent time working help desk have done. I did some client configuration stuff, some vulnerability management, and then just regular run-of-the-mill system admin work. And then a couple of years ago, I actually transitioned into a tier 1 SOC analyst role, where I spent time going through SIEM alerts, building on my cybersecurity knowledge base as much as possible. And then eventually I got to transition into incident response and threat hunting.
Perfect. So kind of a question on your background. Do you feel like your sysadmin help desk experience prepared you for that first SOC analyst role? Do you think it was a necessary step in order to be successful at it?
I think that some of the knowledge I gained was definitely useful, especially when I first started off as a SOC analyst, like learning about protocols, net flow, and how traffic flows between like the clients and the servers that I would administer. And then I actually had some Active Directory experience, which ended up being pretty useful in the role that I ended up in.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like it all kind of built up to that point where you are now. So that's awesome. Josh, go ahead and tell us about yourself.
Yeah, so Josh Murchie, currently work for AMD, doing threat hunting and a little bit of incident response. Got into this whole cybersecurity thing kind of on accident. Was active duty Air Force. Did not come from a systems administrator background. Was actually aircraft maintenance. So the Air Force is kind of special in that regard, that they'll take you and train you to do a job while paying you, right? So not something that's super common anymore. So got the opportunity to do that. I also did tier 1 SOC analyst like Ashley did. And then after doing some tier 1 analyst work, moved over into the threat hunting team for the Air Force. Did that for about a year and a half, and then moved into digital forensics and malware analysis. Got out of the Air Force, and now I'm at AMD.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a pretty interesting background. I tell people a lot of the time, like some of the best DFIR people I know came from aircraft maintenance, or they didn't do IT or sysadmin work, kind of like myself and Ashley did before they got into security. And I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah,
Question though. So, go ahead, Josh, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was going to say there's a lot of troubleshooting, right? So, plane comes down broken, you get told what's wrong, but you got to go fix it. You got to figure it out. It's a lot of interconnecting systems and parts. And so a lot of cybersecurity is figuring out what's wrong, right? Why is this doing this? What's the root cause of the problem? And so aircraft maintenance teaches you that skill, and it kind of translates over.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome. You basically answered the question that I was going to ask. Kind of what skills did you have that transferred over? Kind of, were you always interested in IT and security, or was it just like kind of happened?
Yeah, no, actually, I distinctly remember learning about DEF CON and just this general nebulous concept of hacking, right? Back when I was in probably like middle school. And I was like, oh, that's sick. That's what I want to do. Checked out how to hack books from the library, which obviously that worked out real well. But yeah, no, cybersecurity was definitely something I was always interested in. Didn't really know how to get into it at the time. That's something that I think has changed over the years, that Reddit communities and Twitter and whatever else is all out there now to kind of help you network and figure out, how do I get from point A to point B? Back in the day, I mean, And I say back in the day, I'm saying like maybe around like 2007 through like even like early 2010s, right? That those communities didn't exist. And so you just kind of had to figure it out yourself.
Yeah, I remember back in the day, like you're saying, 2007, like scraping Stack Overflow or some old school forum to find an answer to a problem I was doing
Yep.
with programming. But you always would come across those security concepts too, and
Yep.
that's pretty cool though. It's a pretty interesting background. Ashley, do you feel like you said you did some vulnerability management type work, right?
Mhm.
Did that kind of like drive you to the security side, or was it just you were always interested in security, or kind of that sparked it?
No, funny enough, I'm basically the opposite of Josh. Like, I wasn't ever really interested in computers. My dad was a system admin too. So he was always pushing us to get into it, but I didn't really find myself like naturally driven to want to do that stuff. And I joined the Air Force with an open contract and just kind of said, you know what, I'll let, the military pick what I do. They had a lot of system admin jobs open at the time. And so I got into it and I ended up really, really loving it. And the vulnerability management stuff definitely got me interested because I ran all of the Nessus scans for the base that I was working at the time. And I wanted to know why certain Nessus vulnerabilities kept showing up repeatedly, even though we had patched them. So then it made me start reading the footnotes and get into maybe sometimes they need a registry fix. Well, I don't really know about the registry. So let me dive into that and see what that means and what this key means and what are the repercussions for changing it or not changing it. And it definitely got me like looking at the cybersecurity field that Murchie and I both ended up transitioning into.
Yeah, it always seems to stem from that curiosity, right?
Yep.
I think all three of us kind of share that, and that's kind of a perfect segue to our next question. What skills do you think are important for cybersecurity and the job you have right now? So threat hunting. So Ashley, why don't you go ahead and start with this one?
Sure. I kind of divide them into the two categories that we see a lot, especially if you're on Twitter. Everyone talks about the technical skills that are really important and then maybe the more soft skills that are important. But as far as technical skills, if you're good with operating system internals, or like I was mentioning earlier, like different protocols or network flow and how traffic flows between different endpoints, I think that's really important, especially if you're transitioning into threat hunting, because having that understanding will help you find anomalies later on. As far as the non-technical things go, we already talked about curiosity. That's something that you can't really teach yourself. So if you don't innately have curiosity or intrinsic motivation, it's going to be really, really hard for you to excel in a lot of the DFIR fields, but I feel like especially threat hunting, that's important. And then pattern recognition is a really big one. That's most of our job is pattern recognition and noticing anomalies. And if you're really good at that already, it'll really help you.
I do want to jump in there and say those skills are almost the exact same when it comes to offensive security, being curious, digging into problems, and so on. So, Josh, I'm curious to hear your take on this as well.
So I'll start with the non-technical, right? And this one may not even necessarily fall into the bucket of a skill, but confidence. You're going to be kind of on the spot when you make an assessment about something being a threat, and you need to have the confidence to speak to what you've found and why it's a valid threat and why there's a risk there. So I mean, everybody feels a little unconfident at times. It's hard talking to executive stakeholders or maybe a manager about whatever it is that you've found. And obviously there's always going to be some element of uncertainty about what you found. You're never really going to have typically the smoking gun staring right at you, but just being able to assert yourself and say, hey, look, I'm the subject matter expert here. This is what I found. This is why it's a risk. This is why I think it's bad, and just sticking to it. Right. And if in the end, if you end up being wrong, that's okay, because you had to make the assessment. You had to be the one to make the call, and you're not going to make them right every single time. And so I think there's also an element of just humility, right? Again, maybe not a skill, but an innate, kind of trait that you would have is being willing to accept that sometimes you're going to be wrong, and that's okay. As far as the technical skills, man, it's so difficult because threat hunting kind of encompasses a lot of technical knowledge. You could be super savvy in Windows internals and completely lacking in Linux, vice versa. There's so many niches, so to speak, that threat hunting encompasses, and that you're kind of expected to have some sort of baseline skill or knowledge in, that honestly, just bringing to the table at least a little bit of everything, and then preferably maybe a lot of something, and you'll be just fine, right? Because ideally, if you're working on a team, anything that you're lacking, you'll be able to fit in with that team and kind of combine the technical skills that you have and be one like super team, right?
Yeah, that's awesome. This goes for all sides of security, right? The communication piece is so important. Being able to communicate the severity of a vulnerability or the severity of a finding. And so kind of pulling out the offensive side, when I talk about adversary emulation, I'm always talking about the threat intelligence that drives the operation. The threat intelligence says this technique is important, so we're going to test it. Do you find that threat intelligence plays a big part in threat hunting? Go ahead, Ashley.
Yeah, it's a huge part. Honestly, I feel like Josh was talking about this earlier, but a huge part of the job is that curiosity and learning more and figuring out why things are acting a certain way or the behavior behind certain attacks, especially new ones. I feel like I'm always on Twitter or blogs looking for the new vulnerability that's been released and any preliminary data that people have released or IOCs. Even better if I can find like a proof of concept for an attack someone has released, because then I can do my own intelligence gathering and IOC, I guess, harvesting from whatever I'm able to find. That's a huge piece of it.
Cool. Josh, did you have a take on the threat intelligence piece?
I mean, there's a reason that there's the word threat in both of those things, right? That's, I mean, yeah, Ashley pretty much hit it spot on, right? Like, think of what year we've had as blue teamers in 2021 so far. Yep. Print Nightmare, whatever they're calling the SAM vulnerability that just got released this week.
It's called Hive Nightmare or Hive
Nightmare. Yeah, I mean, exchange vulnerabilities, like just all of those things. It's been a doozy of a year, and threat intel absolutely plays a part. It's probably what plays the biggest part in threat hunting. So, and I think that's pretty much just closes the chapter on that, right? Like, end of story. Like, it's a massive part of it.
Yeah, I don't remember who the quote goes to, but threat intel or intel driven operations is the way to go, right? Yep. Or intel driven threat hunts. So this is kind of a perfect segue into, I would like to hear your definition, each of yours definition about what do you think threat hunting is? Josh, go ahead and start on this one if you don't mind.
So within the community, I'd say that we've kind of coalesced around some specifics. Definitely some disagreement on some of the edge cases or the variations. And I mean, we'll see if I'm correct in that assessment when Ashley gives her definition. But, in a nutshell, you're proactively looking for adversaries on your network, right? So you're not sitting around looking at the seam and assuming that if I don't have a seam alert, then everything's good. You're going to go and take the threat intel that we were just talking about, and you're going to say, okay, well, so this threat intel says that, my organization's in the semiconductor industry, and this is saying, yeah, this threat actor likes to target the semiconductor industry, and they like to use this particular tactic. So you're going to have to go out there and look, like, do we have any evidence that this tactic's being used in the environment? Because at this point, like, maybe we have a detection, maybe we don't. Maybe that detection is working 100%, but maybe it's not. And so it's going out there and it's just proactively combing through the data and everything else that you've been collecting and trying to find the adversary before your other alerting mechanisms have had the opportunity to fire, before a signature has had a chance to fire.
Awesome explanation. Ashley, do you have anything to add to that?
No, he kind of hit it spot on. I mean, there's that very book definition that you see thrown around a ton, like an iterative process driven by hypothesis created to proactively detect threats within your organization. And that is the book definition, but the working definition is definitely what Josh just went over. And it's not just taking in threat intel necessarily about threat actors too, but I know like Sunburst was a big thing that just went on recently, or zero logon. If you see attacks like that happening and you know your environment well enough to say, hey, I don't know much about the threat actor specifically and if they're targeting my industry, but I know they're targeting these types of servers and services, and we have those in my environment. So let me go take a look and see if, before any detection logic has been created, if I can see anything that may be indicative of this attack.
Awesome. Yeah. I think y'all hit the nail on the head right there. Cool. So I just want a quick answer to this one. Do both of you think there's a certain level of maturity that organization has to be, like their security posture has to be at a certain level of maturity before they implement a threat hunting program? Go ahead, Ashley. I'll let you take the first bite of this one.
Sure. I know that this is probably debated a lot. I don't necessarily think you need to be at a certain point to start threat hunting. There's that threat hunting maturity model that goes around a ton. I mean, you can start threat hunting pretty much in whatever position you are within the organization. I know a lot of people encourage, hey, it doesn't matter if you're working like signatures most of the time, or if you're a tier 1 analyst or an incident responder most of the time. There are ways that you can incorporate threat hunting. Is it going to be like what some of the gatekeepy people are saying? Oh, no, well, you're not threat hunting unless you're doing it from this specific region in France. Otherwise, it's just combing through logs, which isn't threat hunting. I think you can adopt it to your organization, and it may look pretty different between organizations, but there's no one specific way to do it correctly.
Awesome. Josh, what do you think?
I think this is the first time we're gonna disagree a little bit, but and only because Ashley just said right there, that combing through logs, to some people doesn't count as threat hunting, and she's right. To some people, it doesn't. What if you haven't even gotten to the point in your organization of aggregating logs? Womp womp. That's a thing, right? So if you're in an org and you're not bringing in host logs, firewall logs, all that stuff, aggregating that somewhere that you can easily search that, then you're going to have a tough time, right? Are you even going to be able to do a threat hunt? I mean, sure, you could whip up some PowerShell scripts and potentially be able to pull logs on an ad hoc basis across the environment. It's going to be slow and painful versus if you were using something like a Splunk or an Elasticsearch that already had that in there, but you could get it done feasibly. So, I mean, yeah, I think the answer for me is it depends. And as long as you accept the limitations of how efficient your programs, or even if you don't have a program, but how efficient your threat hunts are going to be depending on where you are. And I think that ideally you have a minimum level of maturity in the organization as a whole, maybe not even just security, because a lot of IT ops, now is also coalescing around Splunk and Elasticsearch for their own purposes, right? So as long as your org is at least working towards that direction, then I'll agree at that point with that caveat with Ashley. But I think there is probably a certain level where if you're not doing some baseline things, you're going to have a bad time if you try and go and do a threat hunt.
Gotcha. Yeah. So two good answers at both ends of the spectrum, right? And I think it's most important to do what your organization can handle, right? That'll determine the real maturity. It could be technological capability limitations or skill limitations. But those are some awesome answers to the previous questions. I really appreciate those. So let's move on to kind of the more career-centric thing. We talked about our different paths to where we are today, right? So do you think actually, you know what? I know there's going to be a pretty easy answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Do you think there is one standard path that someone should take to get to cybersecurity or a threat hunting position? Ashley, go ahead and take this first.
The spicy question first.
Yeah.
This one sparks the most controversy. The short answer is obviously not. I mean, at the very beginning, like we all have introduced our own backgrounds. Josh came from working on airplanes. I know there's a ton of people who came from aircraft maintenance who are now great DFIR people and threat hunters and incident responders and all that. You and I came from more of like I guess what you could refer to as a traditional background into cybersecurity, the one that I see most often. People say you should, I guess, pay your dues before you transition into security. But no, there's definitely like 1,000 different ways to get into the field. And every day I feel like someone comes up with a different path to break into and be successful within the field.
Yeah, so true. So Josh, what do you think?
I mean, I'm living proof. There's not
Yeah.
one specific way to do it, right? And I mean, but I think we're seeing that more and more in the industry. Like more and more people are like, "Hey, like I think I can do this," and they're trying their hand and they're killing it.
Yeah.
Aircraft maintenance is definitely one that's a little bit out there. But Ashley and I have known people who came from things like geospatial intelligence in the Air Force, like completely like random, or your equivalent of like a law enforcement type job as well.
Yep.
Come in and succeed. Now, you have to accept that at a certain level, you're going to be playing catch up to the people who do have that quote unquote traditional background, right? I can definitely say that on the threat hunting team, there were times where I felt like I was at a disadvantage not having administered like an Active Directory environment before, not really kind of knowing the ins and outs of how does the typical sysad, perform their work. Like, I'll see something that looks abnormal to me, and then Ashley will say, "Oh no, like that's pretty common. The sysads will do that," and it's like I would have loved to have had that background knowledge, but I don't. And so, I mean, that's kind of why being on a team in particular can really help. Where, and I mentioned this earlier, you're going to have strengths and weaknesses. Other people are going to have strengths and weaknesses. Being able to kind of all coalesce and come together is going to make for a better team within your organization. But like the outright flat answer to is there one way? No, there's definitely not. And more, I think more and more we're going to see that be the case.
Yeah, we've seen plenty of stories like that, right? So coming from aircraft maintenance, a cop to a security analyst, and I think it's just really like it's interesting because those skills, the skills you gain, or those like not really like hands-on skills, but more mental skills that you gain in those industries, they transfer over so well to security because you're going to need that thought process, right? The curiosity that we talked about. And so it's pretty cool seeing all the people who have come from different backgrounds find their way into security. And so this next question, flows through with that, right? So what are your thoughts on a degree versus certs for the area of security you work in? Josh, why don't you go ahead and start with this one?
Caught me right as I was taking a drink. Sorry.
Of course, yeah.
I really struggle with this one, and I do think that Ashley and I are probably going to disagree on this one a little bit. I don't have, so let me caveat, right? I don't have a bachelor's degree in anything cyber or IT. Just to add on to the last topic about coming from different backgrounds, I actually have a criminal justice degree. And for a while there, I wanted to get into law enforcement. So my degree has relatively no applicability to the career field at this point, right? So it's hard for me to really know for sure, like, I'm out in the private sector now, but I already had the job experience. So if I didn't have the job experience, would having the degree have helped me? And I can't answer that. I will say I am pursuing a master's degree right now in cybersecurity. I'm, at the particular institution that I'm attending, I can't say that I'm particularly impressed. A lot of it feels very, for a master's degree, it feels like something that I would have assumed would be prior knowledge that somebody would have come into the master's degree program with. So had I been in a position where I legitimately needed that knowledge, okay, that would have been great. But have I really mastered the concepts right? Because that's the kind of the key word there in master's degree. It's a graduate level degree. Now, BS, I get it. That's a little bit different, or a bachelor's degree. That's a little bit different because you are kind of in that more introductory degree, so to speak, right? That's one of the first stepping stones. But job experience, I think, trumps degrees in this industry. Again, we know a ton of people that do this job and do variations of this job who don't have degrees, or if they have degrees, doesn't really seem like it helped them that much. I think you kind of have to weigh the costs and the benefits. Everything in life is pros and cons, cost and benefit. What is a degree in this field going to get you versus maybe putting in some time instead of going to school, doing help desk, moving into sysad, moving into that tier 1 SOC analyst role? Are you going to be better positioned? Can you get a degree later, once you've established yourself in security? There's a lot of different ways to kind of get to your end goal from point A to point B. And I have to say that I just don't think it's worth it. But again, I'm in one particular boat and Ashley's in a totally different boat. And so I'm curious to hear her thoughts.
Yeah, go for it before I jump in, Ashley. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. No. So first of all, I actually agree with you completely because I am also pursuing a master's degree just through a different university. And mine's even specifically digital forensics master's degree instead of just like a general cybersecurity degree like my bachelor's was. Sort of the same thought process, honestly. Like I'm in some of these classes and I'm going through, I've gone through 4 classes now. And some of the stuff we're going over, I'm like, if you have, I kind of think of it as like 2 tracks. Like there's the experience track, whether that's formal work experience or just experience that you've gained by doing this in your free time, like a lot of people have. And then like the academic track. If you've gone on that experience track, whether that's all security or IT or anything, I feel like you pick stuff up so much quicker than it seems like the academic track seems to go over some of that knowledge. And I'm not saying just this example that I'm about to use, I'm not saying that you need to know this information to be successful, but an example is one of my discussion topics, one of the weeks I was in, and one of the first classes I took in this graduate program, we were going over what I personally consider to be fairly basic, especially considering, again, this is a graduate program, but we were going over the difference between hashing and encrypting. And there were people who were having a hard time grasping that concept. And that in and of itself isn't necessarily bad, but just I feel like the topic itself, I felt as though that was fairly basic, especially because if you go more of a certification route and you're studying and practicing in preparation for a certification, which has a much shorter timeline most of the time, you can teach yourself those knowledge concepts fairly quickly. Oh, sorry about that. But I feel like like I said, the academic track, I completely agree with Josh. It seems pretty slow and it's a really expensive and time consuming route to go. So I don't think it's necessarily the most beneficial. I personally am choosing to go that route, just more of like a personal bucket list kind of goal. I don't really think that it's necessary by any means. And like I said, I think you can learn just as much information and in a different way than if you put a lot of emphasis on the degree, because we were talking about this earlier, but threat hunting and a lot of things have a book definition and a more practical, realistic definition. And it's the same thing with system admin work. Like there's a book answer to a lot of the tasks you're going to do as a system admin. But then, just from experience, like, well, I mean, I know it says that, but here's what I'm practically going to do. And I make that decision because of the experience that I have. And I feel like the experience is really, really valuable in this field.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think education is valuable. If that's a goal of yours, do it. Because most likely if you have that goal, you're most likely going to be putting in the study time to really learn the concepts and not just, jump into a class because it's a part of your degree plan.
Yep.
And so that's something that the listeners or viewers need to keep in mind is if you're passionate about it and you can afford to do it, or you want to take the cost benefit approach, go for it or look at a different path. So awesome answers. Okay. Education is important. Certs are important. If you want them, go for them. But obviously experience counts for something. And that's the difficult thing. How do you get the experience without the experience to get into the job, right? So this kind of transitioned to more of a interview, like job interview format, right? So I want you guys to tell me something. Like if you were interviewing someone for your role specifically, like a threat hunting role, what is something you would ask them to kind of gauge whether or not they would be good for this role or not? Josh, go ahead and take this one.
Potentially unexpected answer. I want to know if they've got a home lab. I want to know what they do in their free time that potentially makes them a good candidate for someone that I can tell has that innate level of curiosity or drive to do this job. And I recognize that, it's to say that, oh, well, you've got a home lab, right? Like, oh, you've got some money to throw down on, processors and hard drives and equipment and everything else, right? But I'm not saying it needs to be the bougiest lab out there, right? If it's a couple Raspberry Pis and you're running some Docker containers, hey, I'm good with that, right? Or as long as you're doing something that shows me that you are interested in the field itself and not just in this as a job, right? I guess maybe career versus job, so to speak, would be a good way to phrase that. Because the fact of the matter is, like, we keep hearing in the news, like, oh, the shortage of cybersecurity professionals, the shortage of professionals. And I get it. Not everybody's going to be, a rock star person in cybersecurity who eats, sleeps, and breathes this career field all the time. That's probably super unhealthy realistically, and you're going to burn out anyway. But as long as you can show me that, like, you're not just in this for a paycheck and you are legitimately interested in this as a field, to me, that's going to give you a leg up over other candidates that aren't doing those things. And again, I'm not even going to judge the amount of time that you can dedicate to your lab. We all have lives, right? I've got 2 kids. It gets crazy over here. Taking care of the house, taking care of what needs to get done day to day. I will say the amount of time that I spend home labbing has decreased significantly since having kids. So I get it. Like, everybody's got their different commitments and life circumstances. But if you're doing anything at all and can speak to it, then I'm impressed and I'm interested and I want to hear more.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And when it comes to resources, like a presentation I gave recently, I gave an example of 3 levels of the home labs, right? So you could go the high end with plenty of money to throw at it, or you could go the low end where it's literally just 2 VMs on your host and you're testing attacks and seeing what they look like after the attack happens. Like, to me, and it sounds like if someone brought that up during an interview with you, that would interest you. They're putting in the time, whether that be a few minutes or a couple hours a day, in order to learn what, the new attacks look like. So I think that's important too. So great interview question, Josh. So Ashley, go for it.
Okay. I have kind of 2 questions, but I'm going to cheat and just kind of sort of combine them into one question. In an attempt to, I guess, to kind of extract what Josh is also trying to extract with the curiosity in the home lab, I would say, let's say you're setting up a threat hunt hypothesis. What factors or data sources would you need to conduct whatever the hypothesis is that you're generating? And I would ask that because I'm curious to see their thought process and their creativity and where they could pull certain information from and how they would maybe analyze it when coming up with something to threat hunt for. And then the follow-up question would be, okay, now that you've put the effort in and you've done your threat hunt, what do you do if you don't find anything? Because one of the biggest things, I think Josh mentioned this earlier, is threat hunting is a fickle job a lot of the time. Sometimes you'll put I feel like sometimes I've put like weeks into researching like an attack or some sort of TTP or something. And I've done a ton of research and I'm like, okay, WMI, I know this inside and out. Like, here's all the different ways that I could detect it. Here's the type of activity I could look for. And then I'm like, I'm ready to go. I have my data sources picked out and I execute it. And I'm like, I haven't found anything useful here. So I want to know, what are you going to do? Is that going to crush you the first time you can't find anything? Because sometimes it's not the first time, but it's the first and the second and the third. And that's when you start to see burnout if you're repeatedly not able to find anything. How are you going to recover from that? Is your curiosity going to be killed? Again, that's another opportunity for creativity. Like, what if you can't find anything with the first method? Have you considered other methods that you might be able to look for that same activity or sort of related activity? Or can you find a different point within the attack chain maybe that you haven't considered yet?
That's an awesome point. So you kind of brought up methodology. So I'm kind of curious, when it comes to it, is the methodology more important than the tool stack? Because, as you change jobs or move into or acquire new tool sets, those change, right? So I have a feeling like the methodology is what needs to transfer. If you were giving somebody an interview, would you be curious about their usage of, let's say, Splunk versus Elastic, or would that matter? Josh, what do you think?
Obviously, if I'm working at a Splunk shop, there's going to be less spin up time getting you accustomed to Splunk, because if you know Splunk, right? So I don't have to worry about that lag time of getting you kind of in the trenches, so to speak. But you asked the question, but I think you almost answered the question in the question. Yeah, 100% methodology trumps tools, right? If you know the methodology, because I can't really teach you the methodology. Like I can and I can't. It's a lot more difficult to teach you the methodology. But if you just don't know what syntax to type into the search console, that's super easy to show you the documentation, or you just hit me up in an IM and say, hey, this is what I'm trying to do. Oh yeah, you just need to run the stats count by command or whatever, right? Like, so methodology is, and how your brain works in threat hunting is going to be a much bigger part than the tool stack. But there's no denying that, if we're going to hire somebody, it would ideally be someone who already knows our tool stack. That said, all things being equal, methodology wins.
Gotcha. What do you think, Ashley?
Oh, I completely agree. Like there's been a couple situations where either the tool stack we were using at work swapped out, or Josh and a couple others and I actually competed in a CTF a couple years ago, where it was a DFIR CTF and completely different tool sets, things that we hadn't used before, but we were able to like dominate it because our methodology and our thought process was so down pat, and we had worked together and formed like a team. So it took us, I don't know, maybe 45 minutes to figure out, okay, this is the syntax and like the nuance between the tools, but the concepts are pretty similar. And I know what type of behavior I'm looking for. So as long as I can figure out how to look for like event logs in here, then I'll be fine.
Awesome. Yeah, that kind of goes with what Josh was saying earlier about having a solid team around you.
Yep.
Yeah, so it sounds like y'all are both on the same page about that. That's pretty cool. So yeah, those are some awesome answers to all the questions about threat hunting and career paths. Before we call it a day, do you guys have any shout outs you want to give? Like, hey, follow me, or check out my upcoming talk, that kind of thing. Maybe hire me. I don't know, something like that. Josh, you got anything?
Well, I'm not going to say hire me because I am currently employed and I would like to remain employed. No, I don't know. I guess as cheesy as it might be, shout out to the Air Force, right? Hopefully I'm not making Sam and Ashley cringe too much there, but we've all pretty much gotten to the point where we're leaving the military or have left the military. And that's for our own individual reasons, but we wouldn't be where we are without it. The Air Force taught us a lot. It gave us a lot of experience and opportunities, and I'm never gonna, deny that. So shout out to the Air Force, and I guess shout out to AMD. Lisa Sue, if you want to give me a graphics card, please. I wouldn't complain.
What about you, Ashley?
Shout out to Buddy earlier for screaming. Sorry about the dog. He's deaf. He gets spooked sometimes, and he really likes letting everyone know when he's spooked. I am currently job hunting right now, but if anyone's looking for a lady threat hunter, hit me up.
Awesome. And I will include their Twitter information in the video and in the description. So if you want to link up with them, learn about what Josh does at AMD, or possibly hire Ashley, that'd be cool. All right. So I just wanted to give a big shout out to Ashley and Josh for joining me today and teaching you all about threat hunting. So please check out the video if you really enjoyed it. Put the comment section below and let them know, and follow them on Twitter. Thanks.